Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the CCA CA16. And this one came from the Better Audio store on Amazon. If you want to do some research, you can find it up on their store. I'll post a link in the comments. Today it's about $89.99, and there's a $5 off coupon as well. So I'll give you a link to that in the comments if you want to do a little more research in a bit. So CA16, that means 7 plus 1 on each side. And what's a little bit unique about this particular one is that the dynamic driver is either 6 millimeters or 7 millimeters. I saw both mentioned. And I'm not sure for certain whether it's using a similar port to the turbo port on the Z1, but they definitely fit, a smaller driver in the shell, and then has this little bottom piece, which looks similar to the Z1 piece, to increase airflow. So smaller driver, but trying to increase the airflow, better sound in theory, and I think it works. Or it actually works on the Z1 as well, but we'll get to that another day. So after my experience with the blonde BL05 and people complaining that it was super harsh out of the box, I picked up the CCA CA16, put my tips on it. My cable sounded amazing. I'm like, oh, okay, this will be great. Everyone's going to think this thing sounds amazing as a first impression. And then you read the first couple comments, and there was actually one comment that was like, this is the worst IEM I've ever heard. It didn't sound as good as my KB04. So just real quick, let me talk about what comes in the box, first of all. So you end up with some shallow tips. And I didn't even try to use these because they're just not going to seal well in my ears. And I use the KZ Star tips because I know it's kind of a guaranteed proper fit for me. But yeah, I think the people who try to use these are a little shallow and a little soft, and you're probably not getting as much isolation as you should. And the second issue is especially using that tip, is the front vents, and almost definitely not going to be able to see them on camera, but the front vents are sort of in here in this little region. So if you have a short tip and then this is pressed against your ear and this is meant to actually hook in your ear, if your ear is actually covering these vents, you're going to end up with like a muffled, congested, the worst IEM you ever heard sound. So please be aware of that. If it sounds like the worst IEM you've ever heard, try changing your tips and pulling it out of your ear a little bit to give the vents a little room to breathe. So that's my kind of advice out of the box. So instead of running through this in a traditional bass, mids, treble, soundstage fashion, I think we're going to do this not in reverse, but these are the features, the capabilities that popped out to me when I was listening to the CA16. The things that really stood out that were different than the ZSX, and things that I've never heard before. And just to kind of explain, if this is the first video of mine that you're watching, I do tend to stick in the budget range. I don't go buying $300 and $400 IEMs. So when I say I haven't heard it before, that's coming from kind of the budget side of it. IEMs in that $0 to $100 range, as opposed to, I haven't heard this on a $400 range set. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that, compared to the ZSX or the Blonde or the V90, these things from last year that were super popular, these are the things that really popped out on the CA16 that I haven't necessarily heard before, or they sound better or whatever. So just giving you a little context, not saying that this is, you don't hear this on a $400 set, but, enough. So, Soundstage, and I'm going to start with a song that I've heard a lot, and I've mentioned it a couple times. So, Radiohead's Everything in Its Right Place. So, the very first thing you'll notice on the CA16 is the vocals are centered but elevated. They're slightly higher than you're used to, and it doesn't really sound odd. It's noticeable. There's noticeable height to it. And so as the instruments come in, they'll be sort of just beyond your ears, and you'll kind of think about it twice. You're like, okay, that's cool, because it's not traditionally you get this at the ear, just in your ear. The instruments, especially in this song, are just beyond your ear, and then you have this elevated voice, so you're kind of seeing this a bigger soundstage than what you're probably used to, especially in this price range. And then you get the keyboards, which are actually sitting a little lower than you would expect, not centered, not at your ear, but really low. So you ended up with this kind of a big oval shape soundstage, and then there's a little depth to it. So as the song is going on, it transitions through sounds and spaces. The instruments are moving around throughout the song, and you get a really good sense of sort of how big this space really is on the CA16. And that was sort of kind of the standout from the ZSX, which was somewhat linear. It was wide, had a little depth to it, but pretty much, dead-centered vocals and instruments were at or just beyond your ears. And this is kind of a whole new, different arrangement and presentation. And for me, it's sort of about this space between the vocals and the instruments, and the soundstage seems bigger. It's more spacious. It's better use of space. The more you listen to it, the more times you really notice that instruments are localized in space. It's really cool, but it was the first thing that kind of jumped out at me. So the details and resolution, and I think if you read or watch some other reviews, there's, half the people think it's the same resolution and details, it's average details, less details, and I think some of that comes from the fact that the treble isn't super strong. It's not as strong as the ZSX, and it's not as sharp, and the attack isn't as strong. And I think some people associate details with those features. You're really looking for that sharpness. And specifically on the CA16, I found the resolution to be more than the details, if that makes any sense to you. It's sort of like looking at two images of different resolutions, and the 1080p looks really good, and the 4K just looks better. It generally looks better without looking at the edge of an object or a very fine detail. It generally presents better than a 1080p, and I think a lot of that comes through on the resolution on the CA16, and not so much I've never heard this thing before, there's a new detail there. I think you're hearing things much better than you heard before. There's an increase in resolution. So that's my attempt at explaining that. So I don't know. It's been all over the map with some reviews. So I just wanted to give my take on what you're actually hearing and why this is a little different than the ZSX. And I think a lot of it comes from this resolution, increase in resolution. So the first thing I noticed was the Tones and I Dance Monkey. So at 50 seconds, it gets a little quiet and you just hear her voice, and it's very resonant. There's all these little reverberations that I didn't really hear before. Not to say that they didn't exist before, but now they're noticeable, and there's enough resolution where, you get this sense of air and space that she was singing. And I thought it was super cool. And, at that point, I'm like, oh, this is going to be a really nice set. And, it's really hard to explain until you actually hear it, because it's not like you're hearing some part of her voice that isn't there. I mean, it's super textured and it sounds great, but I wouldn't say it didn't exist before. It was just much harder to notice or listen to. But check that part out at 50 seconds. So one of those annoying songs, if you're old enough to remember, Gautier, Somebody I Used to Know, used to be on the radio like every 2 minutes. So we'll kind of get to this in a minute, but so vocals are really the strength on the CA16. And if you remember the ZSX, it was kind of the same thing. You've got this rich, deep, smooth vocals. They always sounded great. And the ZSX, no different. CA16 kind of continues in that tradition. The whole midsection is just full and rich. So his voice, you talk about a V-shaped or a U-shaped, or the male vocals recessed. So listen to this guy's vocal and the texture, all these tiny details in his voice. They're all there, and you don't really get it's more of a transparent voice as opposed to a recessed, traditional V-shaped male voice that you might expect. But so what happens at 105 in the song is you're just going along listening to this amazing voice that sounds better than I've heard before, and then all of a sudden these drums kick in behind your ear. I think it's behind to the right of your ear, and it's like this guy's having a drum solo behind my right ear that I never really noticed before. And I swear I'm sure it's there on every IEM. Did I ever notice it? No. But, you know, this increase in resolution, it literally sounds like, you know, the guy is playing a drum solo behind your ear, and it just popped, and it kind of shook me. I'm like, whoa, I've never heard that before, and I've heard the song plenty of times. Even on the BL05, I listened to it a bunch of times, but that particular part, you know, just popped like I've never heard it before. So again, it's not like I'm saying it doesn't exist. It's obviously in the music, and you'll hear it, something similar on other IEMs, but to actually hear, you know, every drum hit at its location on the soundstage, like all these things combined to a really unique experience that I think is actually quite different than the ZSX. So that's that. So the vocals, as I said, very much the highlight. The whole midsection on the CA16 is kind of very KZ-like, if that's a thing that you understand. So vocals, I'll pick out sort of one non-traditional vocal, one is more traditional. So Kanye West Power, in his opening couple lines in that 30 seconds. So think about this soundstage. That first sample, that female vocal, that sample that comes up, it's sort of kind of right in line with your ears. It's actually a little back, but think about it in line. And then all of a sudden, Kanye's voice is now elevated and a little forward. And all this space in between is something that I've never really noticed. There's just the layering and sort of this airiness that's between the two is something that I've never really noticed before. But it really shows on the CA16. And I kind of listened to it over and over. I'm like, wow, that is really cool. And then his voice, you get this Kanye full textured, smooth. There's a kind of a transparency to it. And again, you know, male vocals and V shapes, kind of difficult. But yeah, it really popped out to me. And I kept on listening to it over and over. You know, I think it's resolution. You can call it details, but you know, it comes across as a very transparent, you know, as if he's right next to you singing. So very cool. So Tori Amos, Cornflake Girl. This is your traditional, you know, thick, rich, smoky voice that she's got, and it comes across. You know, you've got this full bass on the CA16, let it bleed over a little bit into the vocals, and you end up with that smooth, rich, thick vocal, and that's exactly what comes across in that song. Then you pair it with the piano, and the same thing. This isn't, you know, a bass-heavy, mid-light, clarity, BL05 midsection. This is like the ZSX full-blown, you know, there isn't really any diets involved with the richness and the thickness of the midsection here, and it comes across in the piano. And then we'll get to it in a bit, but you'll notice the first thing you'll notice on the piano is that the bottom section is a little thicker than the attack section. So the actual keystroke not as strong as the bottom, but we'll get to that in a little bit as well. So now kind of the traditional side. So the bass, I think the driver is actually a little tighter, a little faster, more textured, sort of a quality over quantity over the ZSX. That's kind of how I would say it. I think some people are going to complain that it's just not as big and sub-bassy as the ZSX. And I will say that's probably true, but now it's tighter and faster and more textured, whereas the ZSX, not as much. So yeah, it's going to be a trade-off. I don't necessarily notice any lack of bass. I thought some people who definitely used the original tips definitely noted a lack of bass, but I think with the KZ tips, there's not really any of that. And something like, Rage Against the Machine is just big and loud and strong. When they say they increase the airflow on the driver, even at 6 millimeters, it doesn't sound like it. It sounds like a full-blown 10 millimeter driver. So, yeah, I didn't really have any complaints, and that'll be everyone's biggest complaint. Will be the sub bass level on the ZSX versus the CA16. But I think historically, I think that's probably in line where the KZ was versus CCA. I think that's pretty traditional anyway. So the mids, I don't think too many people are going to have any issues with the mids. I certainly love the mids. I love that warm, rich, smooth sound. Not dark. I threw it in there because some people are going to say it's dark. Is it leaning dark? I think to some people, because of how thick and rich it is, yeah, it needs some treble to really brighten it up a little bit, but I don't find it overly dark. And I probably wouldn't call it dark, but I did want to kind of mention that. So the treble, probably where the most problems are. I would call it KZ polite, kind of just like the ZSX in that there's plenty of treble there. It extends really nicely, but does it hit does it go as high? Is it as bright as some people will want? No. So I sort of describe it as there's enough to balance out the strong bass, but it really needs a little bit more to shine. And I think the ZSX was probably a little better in that respect. So do you want to EQ that a little bit up? Yeah. Do you want to use tips that are, a little, with the bore size, a little bit brighter, if that's your thing? I would probably go down that path if you end up with a CA16. So the attack is probably a bit too polite, and I wouldn't necessarily call it soft, but it's definitely not as hard as what some of the detail heads would really want. And I think that really misled some thoughts on it. It's just not as detailed as other IEMs because of this attack and I think it's actually better than the BL05, which kind of felt blunted. At least this is there. It's just not. There's just not a hard edge to it as there should be, whereas the BL05 had this blunted version of it, which I wasn't a super fan of. But so second problem, it's not steely like ZSX or Pre or ZS10 Pro, but I would call it the texture of some of especially the upper range cymbals and snare drums. It's almost as if the materials weren't quite the same. And the snare drum, had this weird papery hit to it sometimes. And it's not all the time. It's just, especially if it was lower in the mix and at the higher range, I think it was affected more than, especially on the cymbals. A lower cymbal, like Harry Styles Golden, has a really strong cymbal hit right in the beginning, and that sounds full and rich and ringy just like it should. But occasionally you notice it, and I noticed it occasionally, but it's not something that I would say was a huge issue. So, and kind of to wrap all this up, Peter Alexander's No Better Time. It's this sparse. The notes are quite sparse. There's only a couple instruments, and it sort of wrapped up for me. It wrapped up all these concepts into one beautiful presentation. You've got this wide soundstage, and each note, there's just a quality to each note that he's hitting, and no vocals, so we'll skip that part. But, you wrap all that up into this version of the song, which I've listened to a ton of times, and I'm like, this is just a better version than I've heard in a lot of other IEMs, probably most IEMs. And, I sort of go back to this presentation more so than these actual tones. I think these have more of an effect on this overall beautiful presentation than, it's got super quality bass or the bids are great. But so if you get what I'm saying, I think some of these parts make up a better whole than just strictly looking at what most reviews focus on. So that's my take on the CA16. again, I thank you for tuning in, and I will talk to you soon.